Welcome to the Transformation Leaders Podcast. I'm Tony Lockwood and I'm delighted that you could join me on this latest episode. Each episode takes the form of a discussion with a leader who openly shares their experiences of leading organisations through the transformation journey. Today I'm delighted to welcome Gavin Hands to the podcast. Gavin's experience as a marketing director within a variety of different sectors provides a different perspective on the world of change and transformation than anyone that we've had on the podcast previously. So I'm sure you'll enjoy this show. Let's move on and introduce you to Gavin now. Hi, Gavin. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm delighted that you agreed to join me on the Transformation Leaders podcast. It's great to have you here. I'm excited actually about this episode because I think it will develop in slightly different ways to previous episodes have done, because your background is unlike anyone else that we've had on the show previously, and it'd be interesting just to get your perspective on the core subject areas of change and transformation in the sectors that you've worked. So as we always do, let's start by introducing you. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you first came to get involved in change and transformation.
Yeah, well, Tony, hello. And first of all, thank you very much for featuring me on the podcast. It's a real privilege and an honor to be a part of it. I've spent most of my career working in the food and drink industry, most of the time working with manufacturers and suppliers to food service and hospitality. Up until fairly recently, I'd spent 15 years at Bidfood leading the growth marketing strategy there. Some of the listeners may be familiar with Bidfood, but in case not, Bidfood is one of the UK's largest food service distributors. It's got over £1 billion turnover. It offers delivery of next day delivery of thousands of ambient, frozen, fresh and chilled ingredients to hospitality and catering customers. I guess my introduction to transformational leadership started at Bidfood without my really realizing it. I was fortunate enough to join the business in its embryonic stage. It wasn't the large public listed company it is now. And at that stage, it really was just a collection of small wholesale businesses that had been acquired by private equity investors and bundled together under an umbrella brand. As you can imagine, with the expectation from those investors, there was a big emphasis on ROI. And as a result, there was a real entrepreneurial spirit in the business. The brief was simple: customer acquisition, drive sales, and drive margin. Change was the order of the day. Innovation, transformation, and new thinking was expected. And you wouldn't be doing tomorrow what you were doing today. So it was a really exciting business to be in. And I think that's, I guess, is what's kind of spurned on my kind of, I suppose, my style and contribution to organizations. It is about doing things better, but making it noticeably better. Subsequent to my time at Bidfood, I've spent the last 3 years working more or less in the same industry on a freelance consultancy basis. The work that I get involved with is typically commercial transformation. So looking at marketing strategies that will accelerate revenue growth, perhaps looking at new revenue streams. But typically my focus areas are around customer acquisition. So looking at new channels, perhaps new markets, new geographies. Often that requires some sort of look at product proposition. So I get involved with new product development or existing product development, perhaps expansion into new categories. But almost all of the projects I get involved with have some sort of digital transformation aspect to them. So looking at e-commerce capability, thinking about how transactional data and insight can be used to underpin revenue growth, and how that digitally can be sort of automated to drive getting more of customer basket, getting more profitability, and so on. So that's really, in a nutshell, what I've been doing with myself for the last couple of years.
Brilliant. Well, there's a couple of things that I want to come back to as we progress on the show. But the first question we always ask
every guest that comes on the show. How do you define transformation?
It's an interesting question. I think, first of all, just to say, I don't think there's ever been a time where companies have to be more adaptable. There's accelerated change in consumer behavior at the moment for a whole number of reasons. Markets are changing. There's challenges in supply chains in terms of product availability and so on. And I suppose as the world emerges from the COVID crisis, I think, it's driving some of that. But I think we're also kind of experiencing a perfect storm at the moment where there's, massive, political issues across the world. I think climate change is something which we're all becoming more and more aware of in terms of how it's affecting not only availability of product, but actually, how we have to live differently. And I think the other thing which I'm very aware of is exponential technological change at the moment. So where it's sometimes even hard to keep up with, some of the capabilities that digitization, for example, is delivering for us. So companies that stand still really risk their survival in the long term. And I know you might have heard me mention before, but I often use Kodak or Blockbuster as examples of companies that really took their eye off the ball and just didn't see things coming, didn't embrace the change that was going on behind there, and they got left behind in this ever-changing world. So it's, I think, more than ever, transformation, has a big role to play. But I suppose to answer your question, how do we define transformation? And I think what it is distinguishing between that sort of day-to-day constant improvements and evolution of the business, which, good management tends to deliver. You're looking for your growth, your quarterly growth, monthly growth, so on. But when does that become more radical change? When does that become transformation? So there's a line that is sort of crossed at some point. And I think for me, transformation is about creating seismic impact in the organization. It's something that will step change its positioning and performance. It introduces something new and something which is different. It's not just remorphing existing ways of working or kind of tinkering or improving, stuff which is there already. So I think the business emerges, from transformation looking and feeling very different in the marketplace. In my experience, change is probably transformation if the organization feels a couple of these things. So generally, they'll feel an impact across several functional areas in the organization and some change to ways of working. Often the process of embedding this will involve some sort of, if you like, a temporary kind of working groups to transition structures into a new place and so on. The transformation will almost always impact on people in some way. So it will probably require some kind of new skills in the business. So perhaps retraining, restructuring, perhaps recruiting more headcount or recruiting for new skills. It usually uncomfortably involves some investment, to create more capacity in the business, and that could be, across it could be physical infrastructure, it could be services, new services or digital services that need to be bought, and so on, new vehicles or whatever. And I think it always creates some elements of risk, which needs to be managed, and I'll chat a little bit more about that just now. And I think the level of financial investment that the transformation project will need will probably be quite a bit above the usual kind of level of investment going into the business, or businesses invest in themselves or maintain themselves all the time. And that in itself obviously creates some financial risk that needs to be managed. So I think, if it impacts in an organization any one of those ways, and I think the point of emphasis here is that it's felt, it's not just day to day, it's something different,
No, absolutely. So yeah, it's really interesting actually. Just coming back to something you said earlier, Gavin, about your experience in that sort of food and hospitality sector. It's a sector that has to change quickly and frequently to keep up with consumer demand and the change in the environment, etc., etc. So in your experience, what type of things do they need to have in place, or an organisation need to have in place for transformation to be successful?
I think it's really key that all organisations stay on top of what's going on in their markets. So, at a very fundamental level, having a good a flow of insights and research data, which allows them to understand what their different customers are doing. So, typically in the food service sector, the market is quite diverse. So if you think about it, there's pubs, restaurants, hotels, care homes, educational institutions, even prisons and hospitals and so on that are all provided for by caterers. So as you can imagine, your strategy for supplying a pub or a restaurant is going to be vastly different to one for a care home or a school. Yeah. So actually, generally organisations working in the food service space actually have to have a very broad mindset in terms of keeping an eye on what's going on out there. And also within the space, there typically can be quite a lot of regulatory kind of influences going on. So if you think about, government policy around sugar and fats and salt, there's cost pressures, for example, in the cost sector. So obviously, taxpayers are paying for school meals and the NHS and so on. So there's a number of kind of factors that really influence how you serve this market. And actually, getting back to the good old management theory of your sort of pestle analysis, you've got to be doing those because things are changing all the time. And overlay that then with, I mentioned earlier, the enormous kind of awareness that we're all having now, sort of sustainability issues, particularly because we're feeling climate change and so on. Even at a granular level, thinking about how products are packaged, how you move them around in the supply chain in an efficient way, and also just thinking about how consumers want to feel about the food that they're eating. If they are a meat eater, they want to know that animal has lived a good life when it was on the farm, and they want to know that the vegetables that have been harvested have been done in a way where the people working in that environment and so on have been treated well as workers. So there's such a if you like, a real rich tapestry of dimensions to being good in the sector. And I think, somebody was saying to me the other day, it's not that difficult to find a way to move a box from A to B, in a reasonably efficient way. But actually finding a way where you do it differently and finding a way to make your customers feel different about how you do it is what makes those customers keep coming back to you. Yeah. And I think the industries or the manufacturers and suppliers who work in the space that I see doing things well are keeping their eye on all of those things that I've just mentioned and more.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because some of those were almost conflicting elements, aren't they? The regulation against the cost management, against the changing sort of environmental needs, etc., etc. And they're things that will be pulling and pushing different strategies, and then overlay that, as you said at the start, with the solutions that you have in different sectors. That's quite a complex thing that leadership teams need to be really need to grab hold of, don't they? And will drive some big decisions on a regular basis because things change so quickly.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the other big challenges in this space, and I think it applies to a lot of businesses at the moment, is actually just the rate and scale at which costs are moving. So, in these businesses, operational costs. If you think, anything involving food supply, there'll be fridges and freezers and so on, which all draw electricity and cost more to run. Fuel is more expensive, moving things around on the road. So these businesses actually have never had more of a challenge in terms of keeping an eye on their margin because arguably the margin could be changing on a daily basis. So it's not only the cost changes of your goods coming in, but the operational costs of your business are changing so rapidly as well. So it's a real hands-on environment at the moment if you want to stay profitable and stay good at what you're doing.
No, absolutely. So environmental issues in the widest context, in terms of the environment that you operate within, keep an eye on, make sure that you're on the front foot. So that's number one. What would be some other activities that will, make that sort of transformation or that change successful in that sort of food and hospitality sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking of my role as when I get involved with transformation projects with businesses, and they're usually businesses that perhaps have done quite well, but they're seeing their growth slow. So perhaps their competitors are catching up with them a little bit. Perhaps they've had really good success penetrating certain markets. So therefore the kind of space to grow is starting to become a little bit more cramped. They're running out of headroom. So these businesses generally having to, if they are going to deliver the sort of level of growth which their shareholders or investors expect, they've got to find new ways of delivering it. So generally when I come into an environment to sort of deliver some sort of or to give a view and to put a project together in terms of how things might be done differently to meet those needs, I always make sure that I spend plenty of time just sort of getting under the skin of the organization, understand it completely, how it ticks. It's often quite surprising how when you talk to the leadership team in a business, their interpretation and their view of their business can sometimes be quite different when you go to the coalface. So I quite enjoy spending time when I go into, let's just say I've picked up a new potential customer, spend some time in the operation, co-travel with somebody in the sales team, go and spend a shift in the warehouse, talking to a picker, go and spend a day in telesales, ask lots of questions, get a view from people, who are actually delivering the day-to-day in the organization. And often you'll find quite a different picture to what the leadership might be thinking is going on out there. So it's really important, I think, to kind of go through this revealing process, to kind of look at what are the pinch points, what are the fragile processes in the organization, where is the creaky infrastructure, what sort of things are get in the way of a higher level of success. Can the warehouse and the operations team handle a 20% increase in sales? Perhaps not. They might be running at full capacity. I think the thing for me as well is in most, and suppliers, I think probably in any organization, is that it's probably an obvious thing to say, but it's the people in the organization that created success. And I think what is often very revealing in terms of potential capability in a business is that how well do teams work with one another? So are there silos? Are there what's communication like in the business? How good are people at solving problems, and how empowered are they to do that, or does any change need to go through 3 months of board meetings to happen? What is the experience levels within the teams? What are the skill sets? How well is the organization resourced? Is there spare capacity floating around, or is everything sort of running on a knife edge? I think often when you talk to businesses about doing something differently, you will always come across people in the organization who have very real worries and concerns in terms of how change, even improvement, will impact their ability to run their departments, their teams, and so on. And it's often those people who, as positive as they might be, and to whatever extent they really want to contribute to a successful organization in their own minds, they often just can't get beyond doing things differently how they do it today.
Yeah, it's interesting that, Gavin, and it reminds me of a situation I faced a few years back with an organisation I was working with, and from the outside, and one of the benefits of being an external provider coming into an organisation is you can look at things completely independently. And from my perspective, the organisation was very siloed in its thinking and in its activities. And when I raised this with both the lower level teams and the senior management, they were like, "No, communication's really good. We talk constantly," and then you sort of take that into the individual functional areas of the business. And yes, the communication's really, really good, but the data and the way that they work, the activities don't talk to each other. So there's stuff going on in one part of the business that has a massive impact upon another, and no one ever talks about that. Socially, they're one team. Operationally, they're not. And it's interesting, and I've had it a few times with organizations when you start to look at the silo ways of working. All too often, there's not a common understanding of that, what silo thinking and silo activities are, to be fair. And it's interesting that you raise that as an observation.
I agree, and I think I remember reading some research a little while ago where there was some effort made to kind of look at what are some of the common denominators, amongst the most successful, companies and businesses in the world. And one of the things which was a real sort of success factor was actually the extent to which there is an informal organization, and kind of practical conversations going on when and where they are necessary, rather within the bounds of sort of formal meetings or processes or whatever. And businesses that have that kind of culture where people can say, gosh, I'm experiencing this kind of issue. This is a problem that we have doing this. How can we all put our heads together and perhaps find a solution? And so I think this kind of creating a culture of how can I put it? Just a common mindset of I think everyone helping one another in an organization and sort of feeling not threatened and not concerned with somebody showing an interest in your department, whatever, is really, really important, because it's that informality of conversation which I think sometimes drives change in itself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's happened that functional areas tend to be, and I'm using my hands here, and I just realised that it's a podcast, so no one can see me, but tend to be vertically focused. Deep level of expertise in a narrow area, and it's actually that ability to go across horizontally across the different functions and drive that and manage that end-to-end value chain. That's I think where organisations can usually make a significant improvement, and when they do, the benefit and the value delivered is significant.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of sort of just building on some of what we've just said is that I think a lot of organizations spend a lot of time and investment trying to get people to understand one another better. And I know there's various tools and kind of learning and development approaches around this, but actually, if everyone just takes a moment to step back and think about the stakeholders within the organization and people that can actually influence, doing things better, perhaps for or help you with issues that you're experiencing in terms of how you run your part of the business or whatever. Just understanding a little bit more about what makes those stakeholders sort of tick, and what sort of things are important to them, what sort of things will they be sensitive to, and thinking about just actually almost making it a part of your day to think about how practically you can galvanize the support across the organization. And I think if that starts happening at every level in the organization, whether it's at the shop floor or within the leadership team, you suddenly start getting an organization where people actually know one another better. They know how to actually become influencers themselves in terms of getting a better result from the people around them, and so on. And actually you end up with a more productive environment for everyone to work in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Excuse me. So transformation is always stressful. Change is stressful because people don't tend to like to change. So one of the questions that we tend to ask people that join us on the show is what they do to mitigate any stress or anxiety or just the general strain of working in an organisation that is in a constant state of change or driving a significant transformation, so that again we can pick up on some tips that people can apply within their daily activities.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that's really important actually is it's around managing expectation. I think there's and particularly when one's talking about transformation and so on. I mean, you can put 5 people in the room and you can talk about some improvements to the business, and everyone will have a different expectation. So you might use the word, okay, we're going to get revenue growth, and the CFO might be sitting there thinking, oh, well, that needs to be about 20%, I think. And then the sales director might think, oh, gosh, I'll be lucky if I get 11. And so on. So it's everyone will have a slightly different interpretation of what you're setting out to do. And I think the role that you need to play as a transformational leader is actually to, create almost like a grounded point where everyone is actually has the common view in terms of what we're aiming to achieve, and then also create a sort of common view in terms of kind of what's in scope and what isn't, because often a couple of different things can happen here. And in my experience, often if you do find in an organization where everyone's very positive and very forward thinking and so on, the moment you start talking about change and improvement and so on, it just balloons very quickly. And then suddenly, you end up with this very big thing to try and get your head around, your hands around, and actually it's too large to kind of deal with. So actually, sort of part of what needs to happen is to actually sort of bring it back a little bit and say, actually, let's be practical. Let's not rule out any of these ideas, but actually let's perhaps maybe look at windows of time. What could we do, this quarter, this year? And maybe, that dimension which is being suggested is something which happens a little bit further down the line. Could that perhaps become part of a 3-year plan or whatever? So to answer your question, to make sure nobody feels disappointed or whatever, be very clear on what can be achieved, and then obviously these decisions can be worked up collectively so that everyone's sort of bought into it, and no one sort of feels, the CFO doesn't feel, oh, you didn't listen to me because I said 20% and now it's only 11. Kind of get everyone into the same place, perhaps through a slightly a process which involves finding some agreements or whatever. So I think it's really, really important just to work out, what's in the box and what's within scope, and actually realistically, what are we going to look to achieve here? And I think as part of that, I mean, obviously most organizations, and I know there are some exceptions, perhaps if you're in the third sector or whatever, but it is all about the bottom line, isn't it? So being very clear in terms of what impact that's going to make on the P&L. So what are the cost parameters? What can be expected in terms of improvements in revenue and so on. So I suppose the final point, also not to forget here, is also just to be very clear on who's accountable for what.
Yeah.
So this is often, I think, an area where assumptions are made, and it's presumed that this element of the work will sit over here, or this person is, responsible for that or whatever. But at some point, it almost has to be, set out in black and white, so that there's no ambiguity. So you don't get to a point where, when things haven't happened, there's two fingers pointing in different directions. Well, I thought you were doing that. Well, no, but you said that I thought you, these assumptions being made. So I think it's really important in terms of managing that expectation. And I suppose communication is everything in this as well. Again, in terms of just bringing people with you. And I suppose something which I've learned over the years is that you can never overdo communication, particularly where change and transformation is involved. Don't presume everyone is on board. You've got to kind of stoke the fire a little bit. As many people who might be supportive, there'll be as many people who perhaps aren't, or who are wary, or actually just disengaged and really, well, bluntly don't care. So don't assume that everyone's going to be excited as you are about this future good news that the program's going to deliver. So
it's interesting.
Excited.
It's interesting, Gavin. We've spoken about this in previous shows, and we talk a lot about identifying those people that are detractors. But as you said that, the thing that came into my mind was, the detractors to some extent are good, because if they're vocal, you can do something about them.
Yeah.
But it's I was going to say the silent majority, not necessarily majority, but it's the silent people that we need to be careful of, because if they're not vocal, if they're not showing their displeasure or showing their pleasure, you don't know where they stand. And
exactly,
it's those people that you really need to try to grab hold of, because they can swing both ways very, very quickly.
Exactly, and I think that's where the consistent and constant messaging comes in. So, and also thinking about communication, particularly in a larger organisation or a multi-site organisation or whatever, is going to have lots of layers to it. Your comms around perhaps the discussion that's going on in a monthly leadership team meeting or whatever is going to be vastly different to perhaps a sort of town hall briefing out to the business and just giving everyone an update. And I'm a firm believer in showing the evidence. And I think often, the people who perhaps are, I might call them lurkers, in the shadows, looking, well, what does this mean for me? Am I really behind this or not, or whatever? Actually showing some evidence, and also of progress, but also showing some evidence of momentum will often get people on board. And I think making sure that particularly with transformation projects, make a real effort to make it feel like everyone's involved in it and everyone has a part to play in delivering its success. I know we've often heard, it's been quoted so many times, the old story of somebody visiting NASA and arrived in the parking and there was somebody there sort of sweeping the parking lots or whatever, and they said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And, "Well, I'm putting a man on the moon." And it's kind of, I know it sounds a bit cheesy saying that, but it is it's kind of the same thing which we need to try and achieve. And when you're moving organizations forward, people need to feel positive about it, need to feel a part of it, they need to feel energized. And you need to keep on feeding that energy in, particularly projects that are fairly, that might be a bit longer in length. Over time, people get distracted. You might find people slithering back into their day jobs, and you've got to keep the momentum and just keep stoking the fire.
That NASA example is very, very apt. I've been working with a firm and repeating a message that's very, very similar to that. It's like, what are we here to do? And in that organization, it's very, very clear what the objectives are. And then, so once we're clear about what our objectives are and everyone knows that and bought into it, everybody in the organization is there to serve the person that needs to do the next thing in that process, to get to that end point, and almost look at the end point and work backwards. And everyone in that process is there to serve the next one, to make sure that they've got everything that they need to be successful, to allow them to be successful in provide everything that they need for the next part in that process. And all too often you get caught up in those silos, as we spoke about earlier, and you forget, you lose that momentum because you're focused upon your stuff as opposed to how your stuff needs to be available for the next person in that chain. So we're coming towards the end of our time. If there's one thing, one non-negotiable, shall we say, that you feel is an essential part of any major change and transformation, what would that be?
Well, I think with any change or transformation project, I think often the most difficult part of it is sort of getting things moving. So it's a bit like if you're unfortunate to have a broken down car which needs to be pushed, it's that effort to get the wheels turning as you push it onto the whole hard shoulder. Getting it moving in the first place is the hardest part of that process. So I think that the thing for me is that there is always a risk to procrastination. There's a risk to sometimes sort of perfection getting in the way of good, and people, afraid to do something or launch something till they think it's absolutely in perfect shape, and as a result, it never happens. So it's that initial effort, I would say, is the key thing for me, is to get things moving will require a lot of push. And I think that, a lot of the points that we've raised about communication sort of offer a big part of how that becomes a solution, and also that bit's about managing what's in scope and what isn't. It's about eating the elephant in mouthfuls. Make the big hairy goal actually feel like it's made up of lots of small manageable pieces, which can be done over time. So I think, and perhaps that's not. Perhaps I've broken the rules a bit there, and it's not the one takeaway. But I guess the one thing is that actually this is never, change is never an easy process, and actually you've got to put the hard graft in, particularly to get the wheels moving.
And I take that sort of one takeaway being you've got to focus upon getting momentum.
Yes.
And that, because until you've got that momentum, then nothing's going to happen. So that's thank you very much, Gavin, for your time today and the insights. Lots of food for thought, if you pardon my pun. So
yeah, very good, well done.
And look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Fantastic, and thanks once again, Tony. It's been very good talking to you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Cheers. Well, thanks, Gavin. That was great. A really good episode with lots of really interesting tidbits that people can take away. I trust that you found this episode of interest. If you have, please do share your comments, and please do subscribe and share your thoughts on the podcast as a whole, so that we can spread the word and get the message out to as many people as possible. The podcast goes hand in hand with the approach that we take within the Transformation Leaders Hub, a community focused exclusively on those operating within change and transformation. So if you've not checked it out as yet, please do so today by clicking on the link in the show notes. I look forward to sharing another episode with you in a couple of weeks' time. So bye for now.